All right, let's go to Revelation 17. Revelation 17, we'll look at verses 9 through 14 tonight. Let's just go ahead and we'll just read that. Revelation 17, start verse number 9. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. And there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. All right, we'll stop there. Now, as we've been going through this, John has been seeing this vision of this woman riding on this beast, and we've talked about how the woman kind of represents the ecclesiastical side of the beast kingdom, and the beast itself kind of represents the political side of his kingdom. And so here, the angel back in verse 7 is kind of going through an explanation of what John is seeing here in this vision. And so that's continuing now, and this angel is continuing to kind of talk about the beast really is the focus here. And so the angel that is giving John the vision, he begins to explain certain details of the beast, but he gives this word of warning first, or warning may not be the best word for this, but he gives a word of caution, or whatever word you want to use, and he says, here is the mind which hath wisdom. And so basically this is the angel's way of telling John, listen, you're going to have to really pay attention here. This is not surface level stuff. You're going to have to really understand what I'm talking about. You need wisdom in order to understand this particular vision. And so by this phrase alone, we know this to be a sort of a difficult passage to study. And if you've ever got into this and studied that, you see that by just the vast number of different interpretations of this particular verse, or this passage rather. And they're really all over the place, and there's a bunch of them out there. I'm not going to talk about many of them. I'm really going to bring up 2. So we know this is kind of something that you're really going to have to get into, something you're really going to have to pay attention to. And so, however, as we've done through the entire book of Revelation, all 17 chapters that we've gone through, we will try to use the Bible to interpret the Bible, right? And I think that's always the best thing to do, is to use the Bible to interpret the Bible. When you come across a passage that you simply don't understand, doesn't make sense, try to use other passages to broaden your understanding here. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. So here in verse number 9, here is the mind which hath wisdom. And then he says this, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. All right, we understand it now. We're good to go. The 7 heads are 7 mountains. Makes perfect sense, right? So we're going to go through this, and we're going to see if we can understand this a little bit better. So both in verse 3 here of chapter 17, and then back in chapter 13, verse number 1. In both places, the beast is described as having 7 heads. Right? So this is a standard vision or definition of this particular beast. He has 7 heads. And so here the angel gives us the interpretation. Here's why he has 7 heads. The 7 heads represent 7 mountains. Now, obviously, if you've ever studied Rome or know anything about Rome or have ever done anything regarding Rome, you've heard this phrase, Rome is the city on 7 hills. You've heard that phrase with regards to Rome, and it has been known by that particular phrase almost since its inception. It is almost always been known as the city on 7 hills, and so because of that, a lot of people just kind of take that and run with it and will say, well, this clearly must mean that Rome, or really more specifically here, since we're talking about the woman, that Roman Catholicism is the woman. So people have said that Catholicism is going to be the end times religion, or whatever word you want to throw on there. And so they take that from this verse. And I understand that interpretation, because it is called a city on 7 hills. In fact, I'm going to show you a picture in just a second. There were even coins that were minted under the Emperor Vespasian around 70 AD that depict a woman who they call Dea Roma. If you've ever heard of Dea Roma, she's a woman who is basically seen as the embodiment or the spirit of Rome. It depicts a woman sitting on 7 hills. And so I'll show you the picture there. On the left, that's Emperor Vespasian. On the right, you can see the woman. She's sitting down on 5 hills, and then she has her right arm resting on another 2. And so this was in reference to Rome, because Rome is the city on 7 hills. And so you have things like this, and so obviously the connection is made between what Revelation says and these depictions and what they refer to as Rome. But here's the issue with this. Here's why I don't just go right into this and say, well, clearly that's what this is talking about, because of the phrase that the angel tells John in verse 9. This is the mind that hath wisdom. We're not talking about a surface level understanding. This was common knowledge. This was common knowledge. Again, like I said, this was minted around 70 A.D. This was minted some 20 years before John wrote the book of Revelation. They know that Rome is called City on the 7 Hills. They know about Dea Roma. This is all common knowledge. And so this, the admonition that this interpretation is going to require wisdom suggests something more. Suggests something more than simply Rome. Now, I will say this, and I mentioned this either last week or the week before, that I don't believe that the end times religious system is simply baseline Roman Catholicism. However, and I do believe I said this, I do believe that Roman Catholicism is going to birth that new system. I think they are going to have a heavy hand in its beginning, in its creation. And I talked about how Roman Catholicism now is very involved in ecumenical relations with other religions. And so they're already kind of laying the groundwork for this to take place. And I wouldn't be surprised, and I'm not making a prediction by any means. I wouldn't be surprised if it were a pope who became the false prophet, not the Antichrist, but the false prophet. Because it would just make sense to me that, well, hey, this is already a religious person, and the pope that we have, well, not we, but the pope that's in office now is all about ecumenicalism. Let's bring all these people together. And so it would not surprise me at all for people to say, well, hey, why don't we just make him in charge of this new religion? And it's the way I see it. They're going to be involved in its inception anyway. So, again, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I'm just saying it wouldn't be surprised me if that's what happened. But what John is seeing here is not a reference that says it's going to be Roman Catholicism. That's what the woman represents. And so there's a couple of reasons why I say that. Number one is because of that phrase, this is the mind that hath wisdom. Number two, this is speaking of something more than Rome. We can get that because the 7 heads are not on the woman. The 7 heads are on the beast. Right? And we already talked about the woman represents the ecclesiastical, the beast represents the political. And so the 7 heads are not on the woman. Now she sits on top of that, but the 7 heads themselves, the 7 heads that represent the mountains, are on the beast. They're not on the woman. And so that's another reason why I don't just take this as Roman Catholicism. Furthermore, we see here in verse number 10, and there are 7 kings. 7 kings. And so you have 7 heads that represent 7 mountains that also talk about 7 kings. And so the woman represents, again, the religious. The beast represents the political. The beast has 7 heads that represent 7 mountains, 7 kings. All right. So with all of that established, it was not uncommon in the Old Testament for mountains to be seen as a symbol for kingdoms or power. Right? You have the kingdom or power that is represented by a great mountain. The more powerful the kingdom, the bigger mountain you would imagine in your mind. For example, in Psalm chapter 30, verse number 7, it says, Lord, this is David speaking, by thy favor thou hast made my mountain to stand strong. Right? You've made my rule, my kingdom, my kingship, whatever word you want to use there. You have made my mountain to stand. Well, David didn't have a literal mountain. It's not talking about a literal mountain. It's talking about the mountain of his kingdom, as it were. And so this is just one example. And there's another one, and I decided we'll just go ahead and go over to Daniel chapter 2, because this is going to come up a number of times tonight. And so let's just go ahead and go to Daniel chapter 2 and read this particular text. It's an important text anyways, and it is involved several times in our lesson tonight. And so in Daniel chapter 2, you'll get another example of how a mountain is seen as representative of a kingdom. And so this is, if you're familiar with Daniel, this is the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. He has this dream, and he's distraught about it, and he wants it to be interpreted. And so they bring in the people who they think can interpret it, and they say, okay, king, tell us the dream. And he says, no. If you're really good at this, and if you can do this, you'll tell me what the dream was. And so, of course, they can't do that. Well, God gives Daniel the dream, right? And so Daniel comes in here. Let's start at verse 31. And Daniel not only tells to the king what his dream was, but then he tells him the interpretation of it. And so Daniel chapter 2, start verse 31. Daniel says, Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image, his head was of fine gold, and his breast and his arms of silver, and his belly and his thighs of brass, and his legs of iron, his feet a part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon the feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron and the clay and the brass and the silver and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. Verse 36, This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Verse 37 is, Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heavens hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given unto thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over all of them. Thou art this head of gold. And after thee shall arise another kingdom, inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. For as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these things, it shall break in pieces and bruise. Look at verse 41. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, and that's important for later on, the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. But there shall be in it of much the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of the iron and part of the clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to the other, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. Okay, so look at this. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. And then verse 45, For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, and the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to thee the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. Now, I read all of that because we're going to need some of it, the rest of it in other parts, but for right now, the part I want you to see is there at the end of verse 44 and the beginning of verse 45. It talks about this great kingdom and what was represented, or what represented this great kingdom. It was the mountain that was seen in this particular dream. The stone comes and breaks this image, and then you see this tremendous mountain, which is eventually the kingdom of God, which subdues all nations. And so that was a long way to show you that the mountains here represent and sometimes are symbolic for kingdoms or power. Now we're going to come back to Daniel chapter 2, so that's why I read the whole thing. But so we have the 7 heads, and we have the 7 mountains, and we see that sometimes mountains represent a kingdom, sometimes represent power. But then he goes on to say it's not just mountains, but there's 7 kings. And so they come together, kings and mountains, to say that this is talking about 7 powerful political kingdoms. That's what these 7 heads represent, 7 powerful political kingdoms. Now, I don't think it's talking about 7 specific kings. That's another thing that people try to bring up. Well, I'm going to list the 7 kings that he's talking about here. I don't think he's talking about individual kings, but rather just combining king and kingdom together to talk about empires, okay? And so that's what he's talking about here. 7 great world political empires, kingdoms that have existed or will exist, as we'll see. And so that's kind of the what we have to get in order to go on. The mount, or the heads representing mountains and kings, talking about political kingdoms, political empires. And so that brings us into verse 10. There are 7 kings, and then he says here, 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. So 5 are fallen, 1 is, and then there's another that is going to be coming in the future. And so, again, we're talking about political kingdoms. Now, the political kingdom at the time that John wrote, he says 1 is. That one's pretty easy to figure out. The political kingdom at the time that John wrote was Rome. That was the world power at the time that John wrote the book of Revelation. And no matter when you take the dating of Revelation, I know you may not remember this. We talked about this when we started the book of Revelation, however long ago that was now, several months. And some people believe it was written pre-70 AD. I don't believe that. Others, myself included, think it was written post-90 AD. Whatever interpretation you take, it is still Rome that is the power in place when John writes. And so when he says one is, that's what he's talking about. The one that is Rome. And so that leaves us with a few others that we kind of got to figure out. And so he says 5 have fallen. And so there were 5 that came before Rome. And so how do we get this? Well, one of the places that helps fill in the blanks is Daniel chapter 2. And so in this particular dream, Daniel tells him about this image, and he says, King, here's the interpretation. There's some kingdoms that this image is representing. There's the head of gold. That's your kingdom. That's Babylon. And then there's the chest, and the chest represents Medo-Persia. And then you work your way down, and he says, and then you got the thighs of brass. That is Greece. And then you got the legs of iron. That's the coming Roman Empire. And so that gives us 3 of them, right? We already know Rome. That gives us 3 others, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. Well, what are the other 2? Well, if you study the Bible, or if you just study really history in general, you will see that the 2 large empires that predated Babylon were Egypt and then Assyria. And so and again, you see that in the Bible. You see that Egypt was a world power at the time that the Hebrews were there. You move a little bit later. Who is it that's always attacking Israel? Who's the world power? It's Assyria. And so you have Egypt, and then you have Assyria, and then you have Babylon, and then Medo-Persia, and then Greece, and then Rome. There's your 5, right? And so there's the 5, and then there's the one that is. And so just to throw that up there on the screen for you. Now, that was supposed to have brackets on part of that, and you cannot see them at all. I apologize. But the Babylon, Medo-Persian, Greece, we get that from Daniel chapter 2. Rome, that's the one that is. We can just tell that one from the chapter. And then we got to gather the others just from the Bible and other sources. But so there's your 6, right? 5 that have fallen, which were everybody up till Rome. The one that is, and that's Rome. But what's the next one? And so it says, verse 10, 5 are fallen, 1 is, but then there's another one that's still yet coming. It's not here yet, it's still yet coming. And so this is speaking of the beast's kingdom and the tribulation. This is the coming eschatological Babylon. And so this kingdom will come in the same vein as the others as far as their domination and opposition to the people of God. But it will far surpass their influence and global dominion. All of these other empires were incredible, were vast, were strong, controlled really large portions of land, but none of them came close to being an actual global empire or a global dominion. But that's what this other empire is going to do. And so it'll be like them, but a little bit separate. But you see there, unlike the others, it's going to come for a short space. It doesn't have long to rule. And so even though it's going to be an empire unlike anything we've ever seen, it's not going to have the 200, 300, 400 years that some of these other empires had. It's going to have a couple of years is what it's going to have. And so there is no doubt that the woman then, as it said, the woman sat on the 7 mountains. So we see that the woman has been a part of all of these systems. And there's no doubt about this. I'll quote Joseph Seiss here. He says, it requires but a glance at history to see that spiritual harlotry has ever been the particular pet and delight of all the beast powers of time. And so he's talking about there. You can go through and look at all of these different empires. You can see how religion was used and abused in order to control and empower the people that were in control and to keep the people in line. That was maybe most seen. Well, I don't want to say most seen because there's so many of them that do this. But you can just go through and you can study all of these kingdoms, and you can see how just pagan religion played a vital role in all of these kingdoms. Rome, well, again, I don't want to say Rome is did this the most, because they all did this. We talked about Egypt when we were going through the book of Exodus, and how it had its pantheon of gods, and how the people were so in line with worshiping all of these gods. And then, anyways, I don't want to get on that because it's a long discussion, but this has happened throughout history. You can think of state churches, even now. You can think of state churches that exist now, how they kind of go hand in hand with the state, but they almost have a controlling power because the state dare not go against the church, right? Even though you might have a king, the king doesn't want to say anything against the church because he knows how indwelt the people are into the church. So the king may have power, but he doesn't want to say anything against her. And so the woman here, which again represents this pagan, idolatrous, evil religious system, has been the driving force of really all of history. You can go through all of these powers, and you're going to see some kind of a paganistic religion behind it. And so that's just going to continue on. And again, like the empire itself is going to be ramped up, so is the religious system of the day is going to be ramped up. However, the beast will not only encompass the seventh, and so here's kind of the interesting thing, verse 11. And the beast that was and is not, so we've already talked about this. This is clearly the Antichrist, this is the beast. Even he is the eighth and is of the seven and goeth into perdition. And so you have your six that we talked about, that list of six, and then you have the seventh, which is going to be the eschatological kingdom, but then you also have an eighth, and the eighth is of the seven. And so this is an interesting thing here. So again, reference is made to the beast who was and is not. Again, we've talked about this ad nauseum, a reference to the midpoint event when he tricks the world into thinking he has come back from the dead. We've talked about that. And so at this particular time, the Antichrist, and we'll see this again more next week, but the Antichrist will do away with the woman and will proclaim himself as the only object that is worthy of worship, right? And so beforehand, you had the state and the religion kind of running side by side. Well, in the second half of the tribulation, that's just going to merge. It's not going to be state and religion. It's going to be one entity where the head of the state is also the God that is worshipped by the religion. And so they're going to be one and the same. And so thus it would seem that the change in the governing of the world between the first and the second half of the tribulation is different enough to view them as both very closely related, because he's the eighth, but he's of the seven. He's related to the seven, but he's also different enough to be considered its own separate entity. And so, again, they're going to be similar in the way they're run, but different enough that it can say the first half of the tribulation is going to be the seventh empire, the second half of the tribulation is going to be the eighth empire. And so that's kind of what those verses there are talking about. And then it goes on, and I'm going to finish quickly here. It goes on and talks about the 10 horns. Well, again, both chapter 17, verse 3, and chapter 13, verse 1, describe this beast as having 10 horns. Now, horns, and this is kind of seen throughout the Old Testament, horns symbolize power, just really power in general, strength and power. They symbolize that in the Old Testament. Thus, these 10 horns are 10 powers, 10 kings who are going to receive their power with the beast. That's verse 12. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have not yet received a kingdom, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. And so as the time that John wrote this, and as of now, these 10 kings, whether even alive or not, we don't know, but they don't yet have kingdoms. They don't yet have power. They will get that when the Antichrist is revealed. And so this is, again, and we're not going to go back and read it, but this is again found in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We see this again. I talked about you have the head of gold, and then it just moves down. You get the legs of iron. But then you get to the feet and the toes. The feet and the toes of this image are a mixture of iron and clay. And so the mixture of iron and clay tells us that it's going to be like the legs, which are iron and represent Rome, but something a little bit different. And so, in fact, I think I've got that verse up there. So it talks about how the feet and the toes are this iron-clay mixture. And so the feet and the 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's dream symbolize then a revived but a divided Roman kingdom, Roman Empire, and that is exactly what we see in the eschatological Babylon, a revived but divided Roman Empire. And so this perfectly aligns with our text that tells us that the Antichrist is going to divide the globe seemingly into these 10 regions that are going to be ruled by these kings who are most certainly under the Antichrist as far as power, but in league with the Antichrist, because you see there in verse 13, these have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. And so he's going to give them a kingdom, but they're going to be totally in line with and submissive to the Antichrist and whatever he wants to do. And so again, this is seen by Nebuchadnezzar's dream, And I didn't go into this tonight, but you can go look up the United Nations has a lot of interesting things. Maybe that's not the best word, but they have a lot of world global initiatives. And in some of these initiatives, they have actually, at various times, divided the globe into 10 regions in order to perform and keep track of the statistical data for some of these initiatives. And so it's not difficult to see how the world could be broken up into 10 various regions that would be ruled by a king, again, submissive to the Antichrist overall. But it's just a delegation of power. But we see again, they shall give their power and strength unto the beast. They're totally submissive to whatever he wants to do. Now these 10 will join with him, and there in verse 14, with his hatred, the Antichrist hatred and attack against the Lamb, there in verse number 14. Now, we've seen how that takes place in chapter 16. Chapter 16, just to go over this quickly, you remember that John sees this vision of these demons coming out that were like frog-like, looked like frogs, and they went out and they deceived the nations in order to come to the Middle East to do what we see here in verse 14, make war with the Lamb, is what they think they're going to do. Well, I don't know if you want to call it a war, because that's not really what I would call it. So we've seen how that happens in chapter 16, and we're going to see how it turns out in chapter 19. We're going to see the end result of this meeting of the world and the Lamb. It's going to be fairly one-sided, just to say the least. And so they're going to try and battle the Lamb. However, Jesus is not returning as the veiled glory human that he was in his incarnation. All right, when Jesus walked the earth with his disciples, he was still God, but he veiled a lot of that glory, right? Anybody who saw him just walking down the street, they're not going to say, oh my goodness, that's God, right? No, it was just some man, right? That's just another guy. When Jesus returns this time, we see in verse 14, he's coming back as Lord of Lords and King of Kings. There's no denying when he comes back that this is God. This is when we read in Philippians that every knee is going to bow and every tongue is going to confess that he is Lord. There's going to be no more denying it at this point. But we see that it's not just him. He's not going to be alone, but he's coming with people. Right? He says, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And just a little bit of snippet of chapter 19. It says, and the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. You say, who is that? We are that. That's us. That's the raptured church coming back to be with him there at the day of Armageddon. We understand also, we'll see this when we go to chapter 19, but there will be angels there as well. But we see that we will be there along with him. Now, the greatest power the world has ever known, both politically and religiously, is going to throw its entire weight against the Lamb in an effort to destroy it, but it will be the one that is destroyed. And so that is what we see here in chapter 17, verse number 14. They're going to try and do attack the Lamb here because of the deception of Satan bringing them all together. I don't know, he thinks this is his last shot to do this, and they will most utterly fail. And so just some fascinating things here in chapter 17, and we'll see a little bit more here about the woman as chapter 17 ends, and we'll see that next week. Actually, not next week, in 2 weeks. Next week we'll be doing something a little bit different. But then we'll get into chapter 18 and a little bit more information about Babylon. And so that's where we are.